What is the oldest family lineage in the world? At first, the answer seems obvious. Some imperial dynasty, surely. After all, rulers had palaces, archives, court historians, people whose entire job was to preserve the family myth in ink, silk, stone, and fear. If anyone could drag their family tree through thousands of years without losing a branch, it should have been them. But history enjoys humiliating obvious answers. Because this is one of those cases where the answer is not simply wrong. The question itself is wrong. Before historians answer it, they ask something far more dangerous. What exactly counts as a lineage? A legend, a throne, a bloodline, or a chain of names that can actually be checked. Several years ago, German geneticists received an unusual request. Archaeologists working in the Liechtenstein cave in the Harz Mountains had found human remains nearly 3,000 years old. That alone was not shocking. Archaeology is full of old bones. The strange part was the suspicion that some of the dead might still have relatives living nearby. Not somewhere on another continent. Not lost in the fog of migration. Nearby. In the same region. Among ordinary modern villagers. It sounded like a romantic fantasy. The kind of thing people love to believe before science ruins it. So the researchers did what science does best. They took the poetry out of the story and tested it. Ancient DNA from the cave was compared with DNA from people living in the surrounding villages. And then the inconvenient thing happened. There were matches. Among the modern families whose genetic lines reached back to the people in that cave were members of the Huchthausen family. The result was almost indecently impressive. People separated by 3,000 years were still connected. Not by legend. Not by family pride. Not by a grandfather's story told at a kitchen table. By biology. For science, it was a sensation. A rare example of deep genetic continuity in one place across thousands of years. At that moment, it looked as if the case was closed. Here it was. The oldest lineage on Earth. Except it wasn't. Because the researchers added the sentence that destroys all comfortable conclusions. This is not a genealogy. This is genetic kinship. And between those two things lies an abyss. DNA can prove that modern people descend from ancient people. But it cannot tell you what their names were. It cannot tell you who was the son, who was the father, who married whom, who left the village, who returned, who disappeared, and who carried the line forward. DNA preserves descent. It does not preserve memory. It keeps the trace, not the story. So the search had to leave the laboratory and move to the only place where blood becomes history. Records. The answer, unexpectedly, was waiting in China. Not inside an imperial palace. Not behind the sealed doors of a state archive. It survived in something infinitely less glamorous. Routine. The sort of routine that history usually ignores because it isn't loud enough. One generation wrote down the next. A son. A daughter. A marriage. A death. A move to another province. Another child. Again. And again. For more than 2,000 years. Empires rose with theatrical confidence and collapsed with equal enthusiasm. Dynasties proclaimed themselves eternal, then vanished into footnotes. Libraries burned. Capitals changed. Victorious armies rewrote yesterday's truth. Yet somewhere, far from the noise of emperors, someone quietly opened a family register and added another name. History likes monuments. Reality prefers paperwork. Everything begins in 479 BC. Confucius dies. For his disciples, it is the end of a philosophical era. For his descendants, it is the beginning of a logistical nightmare that will outlive kingdoms. His grandson, Zisi, carries on the family line. No one imagines that this ordinary act of succession will become one of the longest-running human projects ever attempted. Nobody announces a grand plan. Nobody predicts a world record. They simply continue writing. Who was born? Who died? Who married? Who moved away? Who had children? That is all. It sounds painfully ordinary, which is exactly why it survived. The spectacular usually destroys itself. The ordinary endures. Centuries pass. China transforms beyond recognition. Emperors arrive convinced that history begins with them. Soon enough, history demonstrates otherwise. Wars redraw maps. Palaces become ruins. Governments disappear. But every few decades the descendants of Confucius gather once more. Not for ceremony, for accounting. They compare family records, correct mistakes, reconnect lost branches, find relatives, verify names, add another generation. Again, it is less a celebration than an audit stretching across centuries. And without anyone noticing, the family grows into something no dynasty, no empire, and no royal house ever managed to preserve in quite the same way. And now we arrive back where we started. So, what is the oldest family lineage on Earth? By now, the temptation is obvious. Confucius. Case closed. Except history has a habit of refusing neat endings, because there is a difference between an ancient tradition and documented genealogy. Japan offers the perfect example. The imperial house is widely recognized as the world's oldest continuous monarchy. According to tradition, its origins reach back to Emperor Jimmu more than 26 centuries ago. A magnificent story, perhaps even a true one. The problem is not the story. The problem is evidence. The further historians travel into the past, the thinner the paperwork becomes. Eventually, documents give way to chronicles. Chronicles give way to legends. And legends, however beautiful, cannot be audited. Genealogy is a merciless discipline. It asks only one question: can you prove it? Confucius presents the opposite problem. No serious historian claims that every single generation since the 5th century BC is supported by an unbroken stack of original documents. History simply doesn't work that way. What survived instead was something far more resilient. A tradition of verification. Generation after generation, descendants compared family registers, corrected mistakes, merged scattered branches, added new births, removed duplicated entries, repeated the process for centuries. Not once, not twice, again and again. In 2009, that quiet obsession reached a scale almost impossible to imagine. A new edition of the Confucius genealogy was completed. More than 43,000 pages. Roughly 2 million documented descendants from around the world. Since then, the known family has grown even larger. The result entered the record books as the longest documented family genealogy ever assembled. So the original question turns out to have 3 different answers. If you're asking about monarchy, Japan stands alone. If you're asking about ancient biological continuity, the families connected to Germany's Liechtenstein cave remain among the most remarkable cases science has uncovered. But if you're asking about the longest documented genealogy, there is only one answer: the descendants of Confucius. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. The longest family story ever preserved does not belong to an emperor, not to a conqueror, not to the founder of a royal dynasty. It belongs to a teacher, a man whose greatest inheritance was not an empire, but the habit of writing things down. Because civilizations are remembered by monuments, families survive because someone bothered to keep the records. That is the difference between ancestry and history.